We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for coming to Date with a Cure. I'm Eugenia Welch, president of Alzheimer's San Diego. Today, you will have the special opportunity to hear about the latest in Alzheimer's research directly from scientists working to find a cure. On that note, I would like to recognize our esteemed panel for being a part of this event. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, Sharp Mesa Vista. Because of their continued support, all of the services we provide are at zero cost to the community. Now I want to tell you a little bit about our organization. Alzheimer's San Diego is a local nonprofit. Our mission is helping people impacted by dementia, fighting stigma, and supporting research. To that end, every dollar donated to Alzheimer's San Diego stays here in San Diego County to help the community we know and love. As you can imagine, there have been some changes in how we deliver our services because of COVID-19. But in recent months, we have been able to begin holding in-person events once again. People living with dementia and their care partners can once again come to our offices to meet with a dementia expert. Our team of clinical care coaches also continue to provide supportive counseling using video calls, the old-fashioned phone, and online live chat. Our education team has done a tremendous job creating online classes and adding Spanish language classes. We now have a substantial webinar library on topics ranging from Dementia 101 to communication skills, preparing for the late stage, and more. While we have resumed in-person classes, we will continue to offer online options as well. We have dozens of support groups for care partners to choose from, both in person and online, available 7 days a week with morning, afternoon, and evening options. Vitals is a program we created during the pandemic specifically to support the 25% of San Diegans living with dementia who also live alone. Volunteers check in on them with weekly phone calls. These calls can be purely social, but they can also provide reminders about things like upcoming appointments and food deliveries, or identify a new need the person living with dementia may have. Our All's Companions Respite program is back with in-person visits as well. Specially trained volunteers spend time with people living with dementia, so care partners can take a much needed break. We are still continuing a virtual version of this program for anyone who might not be comfortable having a volunteer in their home. If you need help setting up or troubleshooting any technology like Zoom or Facebook, our volunteer tech team is here to help. All of our programs are provided free of charge to the community, thanks to the generosity of our donors. And finally, we continue to support local research by matching people with clinical trials and providing grants through our Collaboration for Cure program, which we like to call C4C. The most current number available tells us that there are nearly 100,000 San Diegans living with Alzheimer's or another dementia. As I said earlier, 25% of those diagnosed live alone. That's 25,000 of our neighbors diagnosed with Alzheimer's or another dementia living alone. And unfortunately, we know there are many more people struggling who have not officially been diagnosed. As I've mentioned, all of the services we provide are 100% free of charge. We are completely supported by the generosity of our community, which is so critical as we work to support more people than ever before. Two of our biggest fundraisers of the year are coming up: our annual motorcycle ride, Rides for Alls, and of course, our annual walk, the Walk for Alls, which we've held for years at beautiful Balboa Park. While I know motorcycle riding might not be for everyone, who doesn't love a day in the park? I'm hoping all of you here today will sign up for Walk for Alls. It's free to register. And if you do like to ride, Rides for Alls is less than a month away and all bikes are welcome. You can learn more about both events at our website. Since it began, C4C has funded 17 research projects with more, next slide, Jean. Oh, you got it, sorry. Since it began, C4C has funded 17 research projects with more than 1.1 million awarded to local dementia research. 4 of those projects were so promising, they have gone on to receive 8.76 million in funding from the National Institute on Aging. You will hear updates from a couple of those researchers this morning. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Marcella Lee. She is sure to be a familiar face from her role as anchor of the 5 p.m., 6 p.m., and 11 p.m. news on CBS 8. Marcella is also a great friend to Alzheimer's San Diego and has worked hard to raise awareness and educate the community about Alzheimer's and other dementias. Marcella, it's all yours.
There we go. You would think after 2 years on Zoom, we would know how to unmute and mute. Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from my backyard. As Eugenia mentioned, I work the late night news, so I didn't get home last night till after midnight. But I'm so happy to be here with you this morning. My mom has Alzheimer's, and so she's 84, was diagnosed a couple years ago. And I'm trying to do whatever I can to learn more about Alzheimer's, help spread the word, and help support efforts to find a cure. Eugenia, again, thank you for the warm welcome. Super excited to be here this morning. And before we get underway, I have a few housekeeping items. Today's program, as you know, is being broadcast using Zoom webinar, and that means everyone is muted to reduce background noise and distractions, but we very much want to hear your questions and we'd like you to participate. To help us keep track of questions, there's a feature in Zoom webinar called Q&A. So when you click on that button in your control panel, it'll pop up a box like this. I think we're going to show it to you. It's different from the chat feature. So if you have a question for one of the researchers, please type it in the Q&A box, click send, and we'll be monitoring your questions. We'll be able to see them and we'll be able to ask the researchers what their thoughts are on your questions and try and get to as many of them during the Q&A portion of our program. And you can start submitting your questions now. You don't have to wait until the program actually begins. Go ahead and type in your question in that Q&A box now. Oh, and here's our little screen show, what do you call it? Slide presentation to go along with what I'm saying. All right, depending on what kind of device you're using and how big your screen is, the Q&A box may cover part of the presentation. So you can always move that box to the side or you can minimize it, and that way you can get the most maximum access on your screen to everything that's happening on here. And again, please keep your questions to that Q&A box because the chat function is going to be where Alzheimer's San Diego is going to be sharing materials and the links that we mentioned in the program. Live captioning is also available. Maybe you're seeing it right now. I can see it on my screen, and that's so wonderful. You just simply click the live transcript button in your control panel to turn it on. And please remember that Alzheimer's San Diego's team of local clinical care coaches is always here to help. If you're in need of more information or support and you want to talk one-on-one with a social worker, we'll remind you about how you can reach them at the end of this webinar. This program is being recorded. You probably heard the announcement when you logged on. And a link to this video is going to be shared early next week, along with the slides that you'll see here today. So if you miss some information, or if you want to share this with someone that you think could benefit from all of the wonderful knowledge you're going to gain here over the next 2 hours, you'll be able to do that by sharing the link as well. Finally, if you're having any difficulty during the webinar today, please don't get frustrated. We have a wonderful volunteer named Cora who is standing by ready to help you. They're a member of our volunteer tech team, and you can simply say that you need help using that Zoom chat function in the chat, or you can call the office, pick up the telephone, pick up your cell phone, call 858-492-4400, the number there on your screen, and they're here to help with whatever you need so that you can log in and get your questions answered. I know how important this event is and how many questions you have. It can be difficult separating fact from fiction, and we're so delighted to give you the chance to answer your questions. And these are experts, leading experts in the field. These researchers on the panel are truly extraordinary. They are the reason that a cure for dementia could very well be found right here in San Diego County. We are so lucky to have this breadth of knowledge and so many resources right here in our backyard. And we know time is valuable. So to everyone who has joined and all of the panelists, we thank you for spending this time with us. And we don't want to waste it. So let's get right to the introduction of our panelists. Dr. Jim Brewer directs the Shiley Marcos Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and is chair of the UC San Diego Department of Neurosciences. That's him right there next to me. Dr. Gerald Chun is the Senior Vice President of Neuroscience Drug Discovery at Sanford Burnham Prebys Medical Discovery Institute. Dr. Douglas Velasco is a neurologist and professor of neurosciences at UC San Diego. Dr. Hector Gonzalez, unfortunately, isn't going to be able to join us this morning. He's not feeling so great, so he called this morning. Dr. Doris Molina Henry is an assistant professor of research neurology at the Keck School of Medicine at USC Alzheimer's Therapeutic Research Institute. Dr. Michael Plopper is the principal investigator of Sharp Neurocognitive Research Center. And Dr. Sherry Sefji is co-founder, chief financial officer, and medical director of Excel Research. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. If we were live in person, we'd be giving you a big round of applause. Such amazing minds coming together today for this date with a cure. It's amazing. Thank you all. Also, a link to the handout has been entered into our chat, so you can pull that up and follow along if you would like to. This is your chance to get your questions answered directly from some of the most renowned scientists in the world, not just in San Diego, but in the entire world. And you don't have to sit down and read a book or scour the internet. You have access to them today. We have a lot of great questions from the audience, so let's go ahead and get started here. All right. I'd like to start with a question to all of the panelists. We'd like to give each one of you a chance to respond. What is the one research development from the past year that you are most excited about? Take a look at, how much has been accomplished since a year ago when we last met, or maybe it's been, Eugenia, can you still hear me?
I can, and we did meet together last year.
We met last year. So what are some of the advancements that you're excited about? Dr. Brewer, why don't we start with you? Good morning.
Oh, great. I get to start right off so nobody can take my answer. And first of all, I apologize about my lighting and my weird situation. I'm up in Vancouver ready to give a talk at the Society for Nuclear Medicine, where we're going to talk about some of the new imaging markers of Alzheimer's disease. And that's just me cheating because I'm very excited about new advances in imaging, but that's not the answer I'm going to use. So, but I'm up in a kind of one of the conference hotel rooms, so it's not the greatest lighting, so I apologize. But I've talked in the past couple of Date with a Cure sessions about my excitement about new models of Alzheimer's disease, specifically the human cell models. This is, I think, a breakthrough that is really going to change our approach at discovery of new therapeutics. Up until now, we've been using mouse models, which have been great, and they've had their place in the field. But the ability with new genetic approaches and the ability to take skin cells and turn them into neurons, human skin cells from our patients, and turn them into nerve cells in the dish, allow us to look at this very human disease in human models. I think it's extraordinarily exciting. And the thing that I'm going to talk about from last year, because this from this most recent year, is an additional advance that took place. And it's actually one of our own San Diego trained scientists, Jerome Mertens, who's been looking at the human cell models that retain the aging impacts, because a lot of times the transformation of a skin cell into a neuron requires taking it back to its almost infantile stage. Well, Jerome and his advisor, Rusty Gage, here in San Diego, developed an approach to change the skin cells directly into neurons without going through that infantile stage. So they retain the aging components. Now you can look at, in a human cell model, the differences of a young neuron and an elderly neuron. And that's been a major challenge in the field, to look at the impacts of aging. There are many reasons for that, but just simply waiting for a mouse to age long enough to truly have that very important aspect of Alzheimer's disease, which is the aging impact, just was not feasible for scientists trying to get their papers out and trying to do this on a 5-year cycle from the NIH. So the ability to now actually keep the aging factors in on these new models allows us to finally get at that very important component of the aging. And in the last year, Jerome Mertens came out with a very high profile paper showing that there are stresses that are causing the cell to lose its resilience with aging. So when we look at the very worst genetic mutations of Alzheimer's disease, the presenilin mutations and others, even those terrible mutations don't tend to take hold of the human patient until they're, at the earliest in their 30s, late 30s or 40s. So still, the person has made it until, their third decade or fourth decade of life without having any impacts of Alzheimer's disease. So what is the resilience that allowed the brain to be able to hold off that terrible mutation? And that's the kind of question we're finally getting at. We're learning from these new cell models that there are cellular pathways that just are not able to withstand that stress anymore. And that's, I think, going to be a real breakthrough. And I think we're really on a road to understand the impacts of aging in this disease. And it's because of these new models. Thanks very much for giving me the chance to talk about that. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That is so fascinating. And, I do work at Channel 8, and I know we have a broad audience today, but an even wider reach at my station. And I'm going to be taking notes also through this webinar, and, hopefully be able to do some stories about this to help educate the public about the research going on. Dr. Chun, let's turn to you now. What is the one development over the past year that you've been most excited about?
Yes, thanks, Marcella. And hello, everyone. I wish we were in person, but we'll have to do with the Zooming for the time being. I think the things that we're most fascinated with are occurring within the single cells of the brain. And when we think of a brain, it's not like a chunk of meat. Everything's the same. In fact, you've got hundreds of billions with a B, hundreds of billions of different cells that constitute the brain. Excuse me. And these cells, it turns out, actually change their blueprint over time in many different ways. And so we're talking about distinct sequences of DNA that are altered from cell to cell and over time. And this type of work has continued by a number of labs around the world that has revealed additional changes that are taking place, from single nucleotide variations. That's where you have the ATGC, the elements of DNA changing, as well as larger chunks of DNA that appear to be changing. And if you recall, the DNA blueprint gives rise to another group of molecules called RNA. And then those RNAs can give rise to proteins. This has been referred to as a central dogma This process appears to be even more diverse than we had appreciated. And so in a paper that was published late last year from our group with a really talented couple of graduate students, Carter Palmer, as well as Christine Liu, an analysis of these single brain cells from, in particular, Down syndrome, which was looking at a model for, you could call it a model for Alzheimer's disease in humans, since all Down syndrome individuals will get an Alzheimer's disease neuropathology by the time they're in their 40s or so. And what was found was that the numbers of genes seen at that RNA level with unusual sequences was enormous. Somewhere on the order of 8,000 genes that had never been seen before with that type of sequence. So it underscores that there's way more going on than we had originally appreciated. And that certainly has implications for the things that Jim just told you about. As one looks at cellular models, we need to understand what's in those models and then how they change and how they relate to the actual brain. So when you put that all together, it really gives you a lot of hope that we'll be able to understand some of the fine details of these new elements, as well as being able to assess them in more human models, getting them out of the mice, which no mouse gets Alzheimer's disease, not even an engineered mouse. So getting a better model to study these elements will be great. And I see that as something that's pretty proximal that will be occurring in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chun. It's amazing what we're learning as we move from experimenting on mice to now such a wider range of study. Dr. Galasco, good morning to you. Please share the most exciting thing that you've seen happen over the last year.
Good morning. So this is probably a continuation of something that we've seen emerging in the last 2 or 3 years, which is the ability of being able to use blood tests to identify brain pathology in people who have Alzheimer's disease. So a few years ago, some very sensitive methods were developed to be able to detect changes related to amyloid, which deposits in plaques in Alzheimer's, and also changes in the protein tau, which builds up in tangles. And we've been able to detect these through imaging methods and in cerebrospinal fluid. And a few years ago, some sensitive tests were developed enabling their detection in plasma. So we've seen a burgeoning of this research in the last year, and in particular, some very exciting newer developments have happened. One of these is trying to place these tests in a lineup or in an order. And it seems that the amyloid tests, depending on how they're measured, may be among the earliest ones where change can be detected in the blood. And then at some point close to where symptoms of Alzheimer's may begin, some of the tau blood tests in blood may start to increase. And so what we are seeing is more and more data from different groups and different studies about newer ways to measure the amyloid and tau proteins in blood. We have not yet seen an FDA-approved test, but there is a blood test that has received a certain designation by the FDA, allowing it to potentially undergo review at some stage soon. We've also seen these tests being deployed in clinical trials to try and help us to identify people who are appropriate for undergoing an Alzheimer therapeutic effort. We don't want to give Alzheimer therapy to people who have memory or other cognitive problems who don't have Alzheimer brain pathology. And the more efficiently we can try and determine what's going on in the brain, the better. So we are increasingly seeing blood tests being deployed as part of the way to screen people for consideration to participate in clinical trials. And then we're also seeing that some of these plasma biomarkers may be dynamic. By that, I mean that they might actually change over time according to how much active pathology is going on in the brain. And so we've seen some interesting results coming out of some of the therapeutic trials for Alzheimer's disease, where, for example, antibodies that are able to remove amyloid from the brain are able to also decrease levels of some of the tau biomarkers in the plasma. And so again, we're still away from figuring out whether anti-amyloid antibodies are going to become something that are very widely deployed. There may be other kinds of treatment, new approaches that that may work better or may work in tandem. But these blood-based biomarkers are providing us with a really exciting and hopefully in the future accessible set of tools to be used in research and then to transition into clinical care. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
I think a lot of people want to know if there's an easy way to diagnose Alzheimer's. So the fact that this is being tested and could be something that we do routinely in screening in the future is really exciting. Thank you, Dr. Glasgow. Dr. Doris Molina Henry, good morning to you. Please share with us the one most exciting development that you've seen over the past year.
Hi, Marcella. I want to echo Dr. Glasgow's excitement. I think I do share his excitement in this advent of blood-based biomarkers from a slightly different perspective, or maybe I'll hone in on one of the perspectives that he brought up, and it's this idea that we might have an easier way to identify individuals that are at high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, and being able to do so through a simple blood test that could be done in an array of places. May remove a lot of the complexity of screening individuals in clinical trials, and that ultimately does promote and will promote, we hope, the participation of individuals that otherwise would have historically not participated in clinical trials, which has become a huge priority in recent years, given the disparities that exist in cognitive decline as individuals age. And we see these disparities affecting more individuals of minoritized communities like African American and Hispanic. So being able to provide ways of identifying risk and promoting their entry into studies by ease is a huge step forward for us in identifying treatments that might work for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do think that is exciting, and a lot of people are interested in that. And I'm sorry, as we get farther down the list, you have to come up with different answers. I know part of the problem with Alzheimer's research is that there hasn't, it's been challenging to learn new things. So I think it's incredible that we're able to have a discussion about developments and ongoing work over the past year. I know when my mom was diagnosed, they told me that the same drug used to treat Alzheimer's is available today mainly, and it's been the only one that's been available for the last several decades. So I know we're all looking for new ways to treat and hopefully find a cure. Dr. Plopper, it is now your turn to share some of the exciting things, or the maybe one biggest development that you've been excited about over the past year. Good morning.
Good morning, Marcella and everyone. Well, I think it's, for me, it's the approval this past year of the first disease-modifying agent, that is aducanumab. However controversial that decision was by the FDA, and that probably will be, there may be questions about that today. So not only was that approved, there are two more amyloid lowering agents who in all likelihood will be going before the FDA in the next year. And so so these are very important developments. There's going to be more than aducanumab out there relative to lowering amyloid. I think it's very important what was said about plasma biomarkers and how that can increase accessibility to trials. I'd like to echo those comments. The alternative is, in entering a trial for an amyloid lowering agent, is a PET scan. Now there is one other caveat to this approval and these potential other approvals, and that is that Medicare coverage is going to be limited for these drugs. And that's a decision that's been made in the past year. And I think it's extremely important in that the use of these drugs will be limited to clinical trials that are approved by the FDA, and so sort of limited coverage to some extent. And unfortunately, it's an advance of the information being provided about the other two drugs that will be coming out this coming year. And so they made this determination in advance of having the information, but we'll see how that all works out. That's a dynamic situation, I believe. But it's a very important question, obviously, in terms of how we will pay for the treatments that we develop in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is another important element. These drugs can be very expensive. So thank you for highlighting that. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Sherry Sefji. And Dr. Sefji, you and I have communicated a little bit and will continue to in the future about what Dr. Plopper mentioned, aducanumab. If you'd like to talk about that or something else that you've found as an exciting development over the past year, I'll let you have the floor now. Good morning.
Morning, and thanks for having me here. I think there's no one, I would echo Dr. Plopper's excitement about aducanumab, just being that the first actually disease modifying treatment in any disorder is exciting regardless of the controversy about it. But what I think I'd like to just say I'm most excited about is the momentum. You know, I'm on lots of forums, and it seems like several times a week I get some blurb about new developments. And so whether it's the plasma biomarkers or it's the new cell lines that they're able to utilize for research, the mouse models, the fact that pharmaceutical companies continue to do clinical trials, spend millions, if not billions of dollars, looking for new cures and treatments, as well as still, pharmaceutical companies are looking for treatments to help the people with Alzheimer's that we currently, we can't necessarily modify their disease, but we can help them live with the disorder. So I think just the sheer volume of new information coming out, the new developments on all of those fronts, it feels a bit like when you're doing a crossword puzzle, and the more pieces that get filled in, the faster your progress goes. And so maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but it just feels as though the pace of information coming in has accelerated greatly, which gives me more hope that we will come to some bigger understanding and some true cures in the recent future.
I love that. That was such a perfect way to wrap this first question up, because I do feel like there's a lot of excitement, and there does seem to be a lot of hope out there and advancements, thanks to all of you and the great minds that are working. And I love what you said, not maybe necessarily to reverse the course of the disease, but to at least allow people who are diagnosed to have a better life, better standard of living. And it's all very exciting. Thank you so much. I'm going to start with a personal question, and then we're monitoring all of your questions. But I think this is one that I've talked to a lot of people in my position whose parents have been diagnosed and who want to know, genetically, am I at higher risk because I have a parent that has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's? So I don't know who would like to answer. Just maybe pop in if you feel like you've got some insight on whether or not people like me should be more concerned than the average person because I have a parent diagnosed with the disease.
Hi, so I'd be happy to take that. So there is a genetic component to Alzheimer's disease. Studies have suggested that this may be as strong as perhaps 60% or so. But nevertheless, it kind of varies from one person to another. So having a family member, parent, brother, or sister with Alzheimer's means that your own lifetime risk is probably higher than if you didn't have a relative with Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't mean that you are inevitably going to get Alzheimer's, and we don't have a really good way of putting a number onto that risk. We don't have a useful strategy as well for trying to say, gee, you should go and have genetic testing, and here's what you should do, depending on what your genetic testing shows. So the most common gene that causes, that is associated with late onset Alzheimer's is a gene for a protein called ApoE, and the ApoE4 variant increases one's lifetime risk for Alzheimer's disease. At the moment, we don't recommend that everybody who is out there and is worried go out and get tested for ApoE because we can't put a precise number to how much the risk increases or changes. And we don't have any specific treatment that is ApoE dependent right now. If this changes in some way in future, then it might be relevant to do so. If you think you have a positive family history or whatever, it may be worth reading up or talking to people about things one could do regarding general brain health, although I think we all should be doing these anyway, regardless of any of our genetic connections to Alzheimer's disease. So there are things related to lifestyle, diet, sleep, medications, exercise, cognitive and social activity, and so forth, that would all be part of a brain health formula. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Glasgow. I kind of winced a little bit when you mentioned sleep because I don't get enough. I think a lot of us who wear a lot of hats don't get enough sleep. The food and exercise, I think I'm okay with, but thank you for pointing that out. I think we all need to take action, right, to give us the best chance in the future of not developing Alzheimer's. So I thank you for that little push to get a little more sleep. All right, we're going to start with questions. Thank you for answering that personal one for me. We're going to go ahead and start with the questions from our participants. The first one is, what is the role, and I'm going to direct this to Dr. Chun, what is the role of neuroinflammation in Alzheimer's? Is it more important than amyloid? Dr. Chun?
Sure. So neuroinflammation refers to the contribution from other cell types that are part of our immune system or have immunological links to the immune system. And these include cells that are known as microglia. And they also include the more classical immune cells that are known as B cells and T cells. And so this mixture, which is really quite complex, is you could say is orchestrated in a way that many of these elements are probably normally functioning to do things like removing unwanted debris from your brain. In the case of microglia, they're referred to as phagocytes, where they can chomp up junk and then they can get rid of it. So that side of neuroinflammation is quite well documented. There are some genetic signals that indicate that disrupting these processes can be bad, and so it's undoubtedly an important part of how Alzheimer's disease progresses. The exact temporal role for what happens when, as you already heard both from a number of the speakers, including Dr. Glasgow, it probably is going to be one where we don't quite understand how the accumulation and then removal of these elements, such as amyloid or tau fibrils, how that removal would impact the disease process itself. So at this stage, it's clear that we do have these non-brain immune type interactions that are occurring in the brain. Exactly how they impact the disease is still not well defined. And so it's, I'd say, a mechanism for the future that could be accessed for therapeutics. But at this point, we don't know enough about it to really design something. And certainly there's not been any approved agent targeting these cells or molecules that's available at this point.
Thank you,
I'll
Dr.
just jump-
Chun. Yes, I was
jump
going to
in on
say,
that too.
open it up. Let's open it up.
Very
Yes, thank you.
very exciting area. Certainly a lot of work going on in San Diego about this topic. And one of the really interesting, other factors is that we're finding that a lot of the genetic mutations that are increasing risk for Alzheimer's disease is affecting these neuroinflammation pathways. So it's a really compelling story, and more to come. That may be next year's hot topic.
Can you just talk a little bit more in general about neuroinflammation?
So
Like what?
So it's interesting that the brain has, and probably throughout evolution, the brain had to develop a lot of approaches to keep infections at bay. And now we see, in fact, that same pathway. A lot of times in modern medicine, that pathway goes awry. So multiple sclerosis is an attack on your own brain from your immune system that's endogenous in the central nervous system. We see a lot of rheumatological disorders. We see cancer sometimes setting off this neuroinflammation pathway that can be harmful to brain function. And similarly in Alzheimer's disease, the buildup of these proteins seems to set off an immune response. There are some cells in the brain, I think Gerald talked about, maybe didn't get specifically into them, but microglia, and working to remove bad proteins from the brain. And it seems to be, it's unclear whether that's a good thing or a bad thing at this time. But the brain definitely does get activated microglia is the term for these for this attack upon the protein and trying to clear out the amyloid from the brain. And you see these microglia change into angrier or seem to be unhappy cells when the process is triggered. And we're trying to learn whether that is a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay. Sounds bad, right? If they're angry. So thank you for
Well,
thank you for
I call
researching
them
that.
angry.
I'm
maybe
just trying
others
to
would say otherwise. They call them, they
No.
call them activated microglia. They're not quiescent. They're not sitting there quietly. They've been called to action, and that's part of the path. That's part of the process that's going on, and some very cool work that's going on to understand that. Again, so just to go back to what I'm so excited about, some of the human cell models now can actually be brought to bear to answer this question, because you can make human microglia and expose them to the bad protein, including in a mouse, and see how they interact differently. So we call those chimera models, where you can actually see where human microglia might react differently than a mouse microglia to the bad or to the proteins that are developing in these models. So exciting area. Definitely, I think this is going to be a hot topic in the coming years.
Yeah, I'll add. Go ahead, Marcel.
No,
yeah.
I was just going to say, what I find it so fascinating is that you're speaking, you all, our panelists, you're obviously very, knowledgeable in all of these topics, and the rest of us may not be. And what you are also able to do beautifully is kind of explain it in ways that we can understand and try and take action in our own bodies, like maybe kind of visualize what's happening in the brain and try and make choices, whether or not it'll help or not, but healthy choices to maybe prevent one of these elements from, triggering an angry response, for instance. But go ahead, Dr. Chun.
Yeah, and I think Jim's really captured some of the complexities. You can think of these microglia as something that's cleaning up debris. And again, we also call them macrophages. You may have heard that word before. They're cells that are specialists at chomping things up from particularly the extracellular environment. And in the case of, say, amyloid plaques, now that raises the question, if you chomp it up, is that like ripping a scab off? Is that a good thing? Or is it maybe remodeling something that would actually get better with time? It's not clear what the consequences would be, especially if you had a more activated state and you shut it down, or vice versa. But there are specific genes that have been identified that are involved in the activation. There's one called TREM2 that has been studied by a number of groups and companies. There's a transcription factor called RUNX1 And that also produces activation of these microglia. And interestingly enough, it also has effects on the normal immune system and can be involved in what are known as translocations or changes in DNA that occurs in the immune system. These genes are active in microglia within the Alzheimer's and Down syndrome brain in particular. So there's a lot of new types of relationships that are emerging, and they're probably even more closely tied in to the Alzheimer's disease state than we had appreciated, to the point where calling it neural inflammation even might be artificially separating things out, because they really are integrated within the entire being, if you will, of the brain. So these are still things that are coming to the fore, but I think we'll be seeing a lot more of those in the coming years.
Fascinating. I also want to take a moment to address the Q&A. Thank you to people who have submitted your questions. Thank you, Dr. Brewer, for taking the time to answer one of the more difficult questions here directly. We're going to try and get to as many of these questions as possible. But yes, if you're a researcher and you're looking through the Q&A and want to just write some words down, feel free to as well. The next question I want to ask is from one of our participants. When is it appropriate, and how do I get my husband and I tested for Alzheimer's if I have suspicions of possible onset on a small scale? I will direct this to Dr. Plopper and Dr. Galasco. We're trying to give everyone a chance to speak, but then of course, after these researchers answer, please, everyone else, feel free to jump in. Dr. Plopper, why don't we start with you?
Unmute yourself, Dr. Plopper.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Now I lost my train of thought here.
I'll just repeat the question. When is it appropriate, and how do I get my husband and I tested if I have suspicions of possible onset on a small scale? You know, people think, is it just age-related memory loss, or is it something more serious? You know, when do you suggest people start getting at least evaluated?
Well, if a person has concerns and is, you know, in 50s, 60s and on, it is worth having a discussion with your primary care physician and seeing if there is something available within your healthcare system in terms of a preliminary evaluation. We're still sort of trying to educate the general physician population out there about identifying early dementia and Alzheimer's, especially because we are starting to develop positive approaches to these disorders. So it's becoming extremely important to identify people early on. Now, we, among other sites, will conduct memory screenings free to the public to be able to come in and see if, do some fairly straightforward evaluations and see if you have evidence of memory dysfunction. And if so, to be able to make recommendations to you about how to proceed, including the possibility of participating in clinical trials. One of the advantages of doing that is the accessibility of medical care and attention that you might not otherwise get in the community as you begin to address the possibility of having an early dementia and wanting to do something about it. So clinical trials provide potentially, after a biomarker, a PET scan, looking specifically for amyloid, if it's an amyloid trial. Also tau scans, if it's looking not only as an amyloid trial, but other types of trials. So there's fairly sophisticated imaging that people can get free of charge, as well as general physical evaluation, multiple laboratory tests, and quite a bit of cognitive testing. So there's just an awful lot of information that a person can glean and understand about oneself and feel like they're doing something positive. So that's an extension of the question, but that is how you get started.
No, I love that. And just the fact that clinical trials are out there, and you can probably find most of that online. If and then also the departments of the researchers that are listed here. I think it's wonderful, and I do think that feeling like you're doing something about it, being proactive helps in that and makes it a little less frightening. I know with my mom, I took her to her primary care physician first. He would do the memory tests. And then at some point it became clear that it was not just age-related memory loss. And then we went to a neurologist and then went down that path. So yes, I think the earlier the better, because it's easy to kind of, put something over your head, like hide under a blanket or try and deny that this is happening. And I think meeting with a medical professional is the best thing you can do to try and understand what's happening. So thank you, Dr. Plopper. Dr. Velasco, would you like to chime in on this question about, when and how to get tested?
Sure. So just one or two other things. Not all memory is memory, and not everything that changes is Alzheimer's disease or is necessarily going to turn out to be something that will be progressive. So misplacing something once in a while, having trouble coming up with words that come up later, having trouble thinking of somebody's name, that name comes back later. We call this sort of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Having an occasional bad day, if your mood is down, or a bad night's sleep. These are things that do not warrant getting major testing, biomarkers, and so on and so forth. These would be things to, if you're concerned and if they are recurring, talk to your primary physician, have some sort of reasonable discussion, try and get some screening done, see which sorts of factors might be contributing, and try to attend to them. In particular, again, playing the odds, it would be unusual to develop Alzheimer's disease before the age of 65, certainly before the age of 60. I certainly do see very unfortunate people like this in my practice, and sometimes the early diagnosis is missed. But very often those younger folks will present with clear memory changes, difficulty holding things together at work, and sometimes unusual kinds of presentations, difficulty with figuring out where things are in space, or reading, or unusual other parts of the brain that aren't working, or language changes, or so forth. But for the kinds of memory, or what are called memory problems I've described, the tip of the tongue, trying to retrieve something, or if your mood is down, I think starting out with the primary care physician, trying to get things straightened out from that point of view would be my suggestion. If you're worried that there is more than that going on, then definitely getting some degree of testing. If the primary care physician is too busy or won't do a good enough job, then getting additional testing. There are research setups, as Dr. Plopper mentioned, that can do memory screening. But again, seeing a physician gives us slightly broader perspective than memory screening, because they will also look at your medical risk, your mood, and all sorts of other things. So hopefully that gives a little perspective on who should get evaluated and at what stage and what sort of level of scrutiny.
Thank you. Yes.
If I could just add as well.
Of course.
And I think both responses naturally were perfect. I wanted to just go a little bit deeper, even in this idea of participating or looking into a clinical trial when there are concerns, particularly for individuals like you and those of the audience who resonate with having had a parent with Alzheimer's disease, or having suspicions that a parent might have had it and never been diagnosed. And it's a great opportunity to be proactive about it and mitigate those concerns, given the way in which these studies are set up, where there's so much screening embedded. It could help provide answers and allow individuals to do something earlier. One thing that I also think is exciting is that some of the trials that are currently ongoing are preclinical trials. They are meant for individuals years before any symptoms might present. And that is also an opportunity to act early if within that time frame where someone might be at risk pathologically or by virtue of the proteins that are present in the brain that can be detectable at that early stage without any changes in cognition, subjective or otherwise.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And to know that there are preclinical trials is amazing. Also, the word that I was trying to find earlier today in my head, which is ironic, right? Because you said tip of the tongue, was denial. When I was talking about put a blanket over my head, I think for a long time I was in denial that something was wrong with my mom because I didn't want to believe it. And she lives with us. I'm an only child. My father passed away in 2014, so we brought her in to live with my family. And I thought maybe it was just the grief from my dad's death or the change moving her whole life from Michigan to now San Diego. And maybe that's why she's, doesn't remember things. And finally, I was in denial for a couple of years and finally I took her in. So sometimes those things, when I can't find the words, I think, oh no, am I going down the same path? But it's comforting to know that we have so many resources here in San Diego that people can reach out to, and that we're not alone in this journey, and how wonderful it is that we have all of you, kind of in our own backyard, and for you giving your time today to answer questions is just priceless. So thank you. I'm going to move on to another question here from one of our participants. And anyone can jump in on this one. My husband has been diagnosed with late onset PTSD and vascular dementia. Is there any research locally that he could join? And also as a follow-up, if anyone else wants to chime in, how do people find out about clinical trials and preclinical trials? So whoever would like to speak. Dr. Sefji hasn't spoken yet. Why don't we start with you?
Yes, that's right down my alley. Unfortunately, for someone with PTSD and vascular dementia, I don't believe there would be any type of clinical trial available. There's not as much research being done in vascular dementia, at least not clinical trials. And most of the time, the pharmaceutical companies doing the clinical trials look for people that seem to have an isolated problem. They aren't as excited about having people that have more than one thing going on at the same time. The best way for people to look for clinical trials is a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And that's, as you can, from the ending, it's a government website, and every clinical trial is registered there. It has a search engine where you can put in Alzheimer's disease or dementia and look at all the trials. You can search by location, so you can narrow it to the San Diego area and see which trials are being done in our area here. And that's there are other ways, but that's probably the best way to find a clinical trial.
And
I
I'm
agree with Dr. Sofji. I just wanted to add that the groups locally have been collaborating carefully to kind of make sure that we shuttle the contacts who have interest in research to the available resources. So Alzheimer's San Diego is a great place to communicate with and say, hey, I'm interested in research. Please put my name down. And the UC San Diego Shiley Marcos Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, just plugging for our own program, has a registry that we would connect with Alzheimer's San Diego and make sure that as trials or studies become available, we'd be very happy to reach out to that group of interested participants. We've often noted that advancing science in Alzheimer's and related dementias, of which vascular dementia is one, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, many other neurodegenerative illnesses that occur in aging, are the people that participate are the ones that are going to push this forward. So we really, really appreciate the interest in research, and we want to make sure that if you're interested in getting involved in clinical trials or studies, even observational studies, we need healthy individuals as well. We definitely need diverse individuals as majorly. There's by definition, underrepresentation in clinical trial participation is extremely hampering of our understanding of the different racial and ethnic factors that are important in this disease. And so it's really, really important. If you're from an underrepresented category of a group of individuals that is interested in research, we'd very much like to diversify our studies so that we can learn more about not just Caucasian or European factors of Alzheimer's disease. We're learning that there is so much that is unique about this very human disease, maybe even environmental factors, social factors, and genetic factors. So we're very, very interested in you joining our registry and contacting Alzheimer's San Diego and contacting the Shiley Marcos Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, where we may not have active studies right now for you, but when they become available, we will be reaching out if you're aware, if you're interested in being contacted. So thanks for that question, Kathy.
Dr. Brewer, I'm just going to put it out there in the public forum. I know I've talked to a lot of people who say they might not want to know if they're at a higher risk because they just want to live life happily until maybe something happens. I personally would want to know because I feel like if there's knowledge, for me, there would be power in me maybe trying to make different choices. And so I know you and I talked a year ago and boom, a whole year has passed. So I'm just going to put it out there that if there's any type of preclinical trial or clinical trial, I would like to be included because I think, using the platform of what I do for a living, I can have a broader reach and maybe encourage other people to step forward. That's why my mom shared her story a couple of years ago. It was really difficult for me to do and take a look at what was our family journey. But so many people reached out to me and said, because of that, they sought help or they reached out. And so, if there's anything that I can do to help the next generation, I'm so right there.
And so that is super. And you're a hero for advancing the science in this way. Some of these studies are not comfortable. Some of them require, cognitive testing, and you say, well, I'm spending a lot of time taxing my brain and coming in sometimes yearly and maybe even getting some blood tests and things like that. It's fantastic that we have people like you interested in participating. And last year, I think we said, oh, you're too young. And I know you're still too young, but that does not mean, in fact, now we've got studies. And so please enter our registry because now we have studies that will take younger individuals. Howard Feldman, who's not here, is running a study on lifestyle interventions or getting ready to ramp up things about all kinds of non-invasive kind of exercise and other sleep modulation, all kinds of other factors that if he were here, he would say, quote the data that says, I believe it's up as much as 40% of the dementia risk is modifiable based on lifestyle. And so he's very much interested in determining those factors and applying them as soon as possible in clinical practice. And already the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study has at UC San Diego has reported out, some of the impacts of social engagement and aerobic exercise. And so these are very important factors we're going to learn more about. It's different than the drugs, but the drugs are important and the lifestyle intervention is important. So I think our next question is going to be about one of the drugs, which would be interesting. I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if people in the middle age category can start acting now, then maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, we won't have as many people, perhaps like my mom. I remember her doing a lot of what I do these days, which is staying up late, not getting enough sleep. And I don't want, when I see my mom missing, I mean, she's very present and in the moment, but then 5 minutes later, she can't remember what happened, but she's very happy and joyful. So I feel lucky because I've heard that other people maybe have personality changes. And so far my mom's pretty happy, but I look at how she is with me and my kids, and I want to be able to enjoy life with my kids and future grandkids, but also remember and retain that. And so if there's anything I can do now, and the rest of the people watching, if there's stuff that we can do now to prevent that from happening later, I think that's just would be such a gift. Does anyone else want to talk about the clinical trials, or how can people in underrepresented communities, how can we do outreach perhaps to those people so they can learn about clinical trials? And we're going to share this webinar in its entirety on our website, CBSH, try and get the greatest reach, and Alzheimer's San Diego will as well. Dr. Molina Henry, yes, go ahead.
Yes, and I think I'll follow on what Dr. Brewer was saying. We also have a registry that is the Alzheimer's Prevention Trials. It's an observational study where you can be assessed on a quarterly basis through two assessments, just to give us an idea of what the status of your cognition is. That one's a lot more open in the sense that individuals who are younger can still enroll. And if there is a trial that becomes available, they can also participate in a trial that they might be eligible for. Outreach to underrepresented groups is kind of the work that we are doing right now. It's one of the things that has become front and center in the field as well. It's not necessarily just evaluating and testing investigational treatments or other interventions, be it lifestyle or other, but also making sure that that representation is there. And I think we have to rely more on the word of mouth, the community outreach, the partnerships, and in community work where possible. I think we're seeing more work that is being done at the community. We've discussed the blood-based biomarkers as an opportunity as well to be able to determine whether individuals are eligible without, hopefully in the future, the burden of all the other assessments that have come with it. Naturally, as different interventions are tested, that may require different assessments, and we have a ways to go, but it is exciting to see the continual movement towards that and towards being more inclusive, to having trials that are much more inclusive for all populations.
I'll add just a couple of words there that this has real meaning. Much of the data and much of our understanding of even mechanisms have come from a predominantly Caucasian population. And so even if you look at the most famous of the risk factors, I'm not talking about causality, but risk factors that you heard from Dr. Glasgow, the ApoE4, that relationship actually becomes less compelling in looking at some of the Hispanic populations that are out there. And it's likely that as we know more, some other elements will emerge, and some that were very important for one group will not be as important in others. And that's only going to come from the participation of these groups in these clinical trials. And similarly, you've heard about the biomarkers in blood, and these are really important, and they're going to improve our trials. And they'll also add to our understanding, because there, for example, are many, many cases of individuals that have plaque, have amyloid, but seem to be pretty normal. And that's given rise to a lot of debate in the field, including in the therapeutic side, about whether that is the primary mechanism. And all of this will be aided by participation within the trials. I think one last element that is worth keeping in mind is we do need to get access to individual brain samples over time. And so for those persons that have reached a terminal stage, the gift of those brains cannot be understated. And this has been, I think, underscored by actual analyses by neuropathologists who have looked, for example, at Alzheimer's disease brain. And it turns out that in over 50% of the cases, one sees other disease entities within those Alzheimer's disease dementia brains, such as Lewy body, such as vascular, et cetera. And this is very, very important because, of course, to a clinical presentation, you come out as, say, having dementia, but maybe it's not just Alzheimer's, maybe it's something else, and that would affect how you treat it. So all of that is so important for getting participation of different groups, as well as having access to gifts of brain tissue that can be actually obtained, or one can gift these through, for example, UCSD has a body donation program, and then the Shiley Marco Center at ADRC has ways of donating these too. And that is a very critical part of the entire effort to understand and treat Alzheimer's disease. Thanks.
Just
Cheryl,
quickly,
for mentioning that. I just want to be on one of our, there is from the ADRC, the gift of the brain is absolutely valuable, but we also want to have cognitive testing prior to death and characterization. So at least in our center, in order to participate in the autopsy donation program, one would need to be in the longitudinal study with us so that we can add other factors to the pathology. So just wanted to make that clear. It's absolutely critical to our science, but we also want to capture a little bit of data during life. Just to be clear.
Also,
Thanks.
someone did ask if there is support in other languages, Spanish and perhaps other languages, and I saw someone.
I typed that one out. I felt like
Okay,
it was
great.
kind of related to the question about underrepresented studies, because we're very, very engaged in recruiting from other ethnicities and other. We certainly have made at least in our case, our center very bicultural, bilingual, and languages, at least in Spanish, and working on other Asian languages and things in some of the sub-studies that we have. Others might want to chime in, but I just felt like many of our places have developed other language testing capabilities. So please reach out and we'll let you know if your language is represented. Spanish, for sure. All of our centers should be able to capture that.
Thank you. I'm going to hold off. I think at the very end, we should wrap with anything that we can do to, and I know we've touched on it a little bit, but to prevent Alzheimer's disease. I know we've mentioned exercise, eating well, sleep, but stress. Let's save that for the end so that we can leave here with a mindset to move forward and be healthy. But let me ask this question for now. And with all of the hype around aducanumab last year, is there an update? What have you learned over the last 1 year? And I will start with Dr. Sefji.
With regard to aducanumab specifically, I mean, the main thing we've seen is that it's going to be a challenge to figure out how to test people to find out that they are appropriate for certain therapeutics. And then the bigger issue of how to get the cost covered. I think that it's still early with regard to seeing how it's going to play out. I know that there are people that have been taking aducanumab for a couple of years now, that it really does seem to help, but it's obviously not a drug that everyone should take. And insurance companies are still lagging in terms of being willing to cover the amyloid PET scans that are necessary. So until we have better tests, easier tests, cheaper tests, that's still the gold standard and what a person would need to undergo prior to deciding if aducanumab is an appropriate treatment for them. Because there is a lot of variability in the brains of people that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it of course is still going to be true, as with any drug, that Aduhelm is not going to work for everybody. But I think the fact that it does work, it appears to work for some people, still makes it a very viable treatment. And I hope that we can kind of work, the government and insurance companies to getting a direct path so that we can test people, say, yes, this is appropriate, and then find a way to get them the medication. So I think, unfortunately, what we've mostly seen are the challenges with implementing the therapy.
How much can it cost?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
Does anyone else know?
$54,000 is the price that was described, but that is a price that does not include having amyloid PET scans, MRIs, perhaps additional costs from the infusion center. So, if somebody wants to pay for aducanumab out of pocket, I would encourage them to be aware of all of these potential costs, and also to be aware of the potential risk of taking aducanumab, which is that there can be brain hemorrhages or brain inflammation. These are called ARIA, which is short for a kind of picture that we can see on an MRI. So right now we're in sort of a state of kind of playing a waiting game to see what Biogen comes up with regards to designing a clinical trial, because the CMS, who pays for drugs under Medicare, said that they would only permit Aricept, or sorry, Aduhelm, to be covered under a formal clinical trial. And so far, we have not seen the design or anything like that. And we don't know, for example, if this would be a trial that would involve the active drug and a placebo, or just the active drug. So we're kind of waiting and seeing what will happen there. In the meantime, there are actually three other drugs that are on a similar fast track status. They have not received the same degree of what was called accelerated approval by the FDA, but there are three other amyloid engaging antibodies that all did something to get rid of amyloid in clinical trials, and that all were associated with some degree of slowing of clinical progression. Although the question in many people's minds is, how much slowing is there? Is this enough to make a difference? And is this going to generalize into a really strong effect as we test more and more people?
Anyone else wish to talk about aducanumab or any of the other drugs on the forefront? I know that someone asked about, and I know that, thank you so much. I'm reading through the Q&A for responding to some of these. There's someone talked about a new drug, BMS 984923, Aricept. And I think that, let's see. There's another question about phase 3 clinical trial for, is it simufilam? Anyway, does anyone else have anything to add about, the
I would
drugs
just
for
add
clinical trials?
just the state of this particular therapeutic field is, it's still the case that it's not truly validated from the standpoint of what we call a disease modifying therapy that is also one that has significant safety in addition to efficacy. So when we talk about a drug, there's the whether or not it works, that's efficacy. And then there's whether it might do something really bad to you, which we call safety. And we need both to have a drug go through an FDA approval. In the case of Aduhelm, it was sort of unusual, a bit unusual, in that in order to get passage of or at least advice on whether a given agent is going to be beneficial, it goes through an FDA advisory board. And in the case of Aduhelm, there was a unanimous, maybe there was one abstention, but unanimous view that it should not have been or not be FDA approved, but it was approved anyway, which raises some questions about the process. Things that I think are still under some scrutiny at this stage. Now, whether the other agents that fall into the same category are going to encounter that same level of say negativism, we'll just have to wait and see. But the issue that Dr. Glasgow already brought up, the ARIA, it's not as though it happened in one or two persons. It was something like 40% of individuals that took it. And this is in a defined population, not all comers, which is what will happen once a drug enters what we call the post-marketing period. And when that happens, someone that might have some other diseases, comorbidities, things of that sort, those things can be accessed. And they weren't tested because those individuals weren't in the clinical trial. So I guess the general thoughts out there are, get back to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. You don't want to hurt people with a therapy. And as one gets into more of these agents, there has to be that conservative approach so that we don't run into more problems. And so this is all going to get sorted out. But I would say that any individual or their families who are making these decisions have to weigh that quite actively and carefully, because you don't want to give your loved ones something that might make things worse, and perhaps not even work well in that setting. So that's where I think these agents are. And there's a whole group of scientists and clinicians who have strong doubts about the actual ability of these types of agents to work. And all of this has to be sorted out. This is not to be nihilistic. There's undoubtedly something very important about amyloid, and as well as tau that you've already heard about. But maybe it's going to take some nuanced approaches to really access the benefits for them without, some of the potentially adverse events being incurred. So that's just to give maybe a more, potentially balanced view that, yes, it'd be great if it just if it worked and it was safe, wonderful. But when you're talking about something that could also make people, at more risk for problems, then that has to be measured, especially if it's not working in a robust way. So I would just put that there, so you don't run out and start trying this without some type of assessment of the cost benefits of, and not in terms of health, not even talking about the expense of the agent. Thanks.
I think we all like to, we see
I-
our loved ones suffering and we all want to try and find a quick fix. I'll let you continue with your thoughts, Dr. Plopper, but I do want to read this because my mom was actually recommended to take, I think, memantine. So Marie asked, does memantine HCl, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce these properly, galantamine hydrobromide make any difference in treating Alzheimer's? My husband has been on these for a few years. He is declining. I know Dr. Sefji answered that these medications aid in the brain functioning until the disease progresses to a point where they cannot function, and that although he is declining, it is likely he would be worse if he were not taking them. So, but I think this is very important to what we've been discussing. I mean, there are drugs, there are therapies. What is the point where they're working or they're not working versus maybe some of the risks with the new medication? Go ahead, Dr. Plopper.
So I'd just like to make one comment about these drugs. So there are a number of different what are called cholinesterase inhibitors. Donepezil or Aricept was the first one to be widely used, and then galantamine is another one, rivastigmine is yet another, and then memantine or Namenda came out a few years later. These drugs act by trying to strengthen certain chemical circuits in the brain that are important in attention and focusing and forming memories, but they don't do anything to combat the underlying degeneration and the buildup of pathology in Alzheimer's. So at the most, they might have a very weak positive effect that can be difficult to appreciate. Some patients do see this, some don't. They may help to keep people functioning at a certain level for a little bit longer. That may be seen as well. And there was a lot of initial research on these drugs, and then a lot of questions as they were widely used. Recently, about a year or two ago, a study from Denmark came out where through having a national health system, they were able to look at medical care records of their whole population. And they found that people with Alzheimer's who had been on cholinesterase inhibitors in their population, the one that seemed to show the strongest effect was galantamine, but no reason it should be different than the others. They, over a period of follow-up of as long as 10 years, there was slowing of cognitive change in people on average who took this sort of medication. So the thing we struggle with as clinicians is that it can be very hard to see this as a really strong effect in an individual patient. It's not like taking a medication for your headache and your headache goes away. This is a subtle effect. And at the moment, we don't have other medications that we can offer that might do a better job. There are a number that are still being tested in the hopes that they will be stronger with regard to symptom relief. But provided people don't have side effects and are putting up with cholinesterase inhibitors, many of us recommend trying them and staying with them at least for some significant duration.
Would anyone else like to to comment on that? All right, so I thought this was interesting. Joe Powers asked, are meds for Alzheimer's taken from human cells, well, acquired from abortion? Typically modern studies transform adult human skin cells into neurons. That wasn't the question I was thinking of. The one that was talking about, are there animal models that do exhibit Alzheimer's that are being used in research? And Dr. Brewer answered, there are other species. Dr. Brewer, why don't you answer that? Because I thought that was fascinating about
Sure.
Alzheimer's disease in particular.
Yeah, I mean, we've often, there've been discussion like beagles and and other primates. Of course, it's with higher order animals is, we need to have very high justification to be able to use these animals in research. So so it has not risen to the level typically that that we think that form of Alzheimer's is or what might be called similar pathologies to Alzheimer's that developed in aged non-human primates would be similar enough to the human disease that it's worth putting it into a model. And also a lot of times we need to genetically manipulate the animal model in order to get the types of pathologies in place. So in these natural models, it's much less practical to try to study that. But the research that has been done has seen that it's not quite the same. You're not seeing the same levels of tau. You're not seeing the same kind of deposition of amyloid. You're seeing it maybe more in the vessels. So it just does not seem to recapitulate the disease that we see in humans. And I mentioned in my answer that was typed, this may be a number of factors that are part of that. The humans may be living much longer than what the brains of species are meant to withstand the aging stresses. And that's why it's one of the areas that I'm very interested in looking at. What are the energy stresses that aging brings onto cells? And at least in my looking at the literature, the animal models where you might see some of this pathology in the age status of non-human primates, it just doesn't mirror what you see in humans. So it's not been as valuable of a model to study. So I guess that was it. And you also don't have the same psychosocial factors and stresses that might be impacting the pathology that we see in humans. So at least my take, and that's why I put the caveat, at least that's my view on it. I didn't say that may not be other people's view on it, but my view is that this is a uniquely human disease that is not recapitulated in other animals.
Let me ask Dr. Melina Henry a participant's question. It says, Dr., and I don't know if you're familiar, if all of you are familiar with this, you can all chime in. Dr. Dale Bredenson wrote, the first survivors of Alzheimer's. Are his claims of reversing dementia in Alz true? Can what he's outlined in the book actually work? I mean, I think a lot of people in my position or who've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's want to know if there's something they can do to reverse the process. And also if there's anything, and I guess we've got about a half an hour left, and I think a lot of people are interested in this. Are there things we can do now specific things to try and prevent the onset of the disease? So Dr. Melina Henry?
Sure. I'm not familiar with the book, so I'll be honest with that. And I can probably speak to some of this, but I think that there are others in the space that probably have even more familiarity with that. I think that that's not necessarily been confirmed. I think we understand that this is a progressive disorder. We have seen in instances where individuals may display some improvement in cognition that may be reflective of other changes and then may be temporary. We've also seen instances where individuals display the pathology postmortem and not necessarily have incurred in some of the symptoms that are typically associated with individuals that have Alzheimer's disease. I think what this tells us is that the picture is complex. I'm not necessarily a proponent or a believer that we can reverse it, but I do think that we can intervene early and change the course, that there are ways to to slow the progression of the disease. And I think that we may find ways to delay it more in the future. but I'm not quite sure that these necessarily can reverse the damage that has already occurred as a result of the changes in the brain that have occurred. But I'm happy to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, I think it's a question that a lot of people want to know. So why don't we actually have all of you answer that question? Dr. Sefji?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the questions in the chat. Could you please restate?
Oh,
it
yeah.
for me?
Yes, no problem. Thank you everyone for being active and engaging with our participants. That means so much to them and to me, because it's hard to get everyone's answers verbally. And so I really appreciate that you're all engaged there. But the question was, someone had mentioned a book by a Dr. Dale Bredesen, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, where he claims, I've not read the book, but apparently he claims that there's a way to reverse dementia and Alzheimer's. And so I wanted to ask each of you about that and what you know about reversing Alzheimer's and dementia. And then also, if you want to speak to what people can do moving forward to help reduce, is stress a factor? We've talked about it a little bit: health, exercise, sleep.
Sure, yeah.
So go ahead.
That's what I thought we were talking about. So as far as I'm aware, I'm like Dr. Melina Henry. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that anyone's been able to document of actually reversing once damage has actually happened in the brain. So not to be negative about that, but I think, just to highlight that prevention and intervening early is our best chance at stopping Alzheimer's disease. I think that some of these brilliant neuroscientists can speak better than I can about the roles of stress and aging on the neurons, but essentially anything that's kind of unhealthy for your brain that puts that makes the environment in your brain angry or unhealthy, or with neuroinflammation and lots of other cytokines and chemicals that they're studying. All of those things come together to create the damage that we see as the pathology in Alzheimer's. And the disease modifying treatments that are being studied, when they remove the tau or the amyloid plaques, part of the problem is that the damage has already been done to the underlying neurons. And so it's good if you can prevent more plaque from forming. And we don't yet know, honestly, the role of removing the plaque. It just, say even if you prevent any further tau and amyloid pathology from occurring, we still we don't know how to reverse or if it's even possible to reverse the damage. Some of that is that the studies just have not been done because it is very difficult to study the brain while it's alive. We still have limited technologies, which, part of the exciting developments is that they're finding new ways to study someone's brain while they're alive and look at these factors. So I think it's possible. The body has an amazing ability to heal itself. We just don't know how to demonstrate that scientifically yet, or not in ways that are obvious, mostly because it also probably takes a lot of time. Yes, the brain could heal itself, but it might take several years, and very few studies go on that long, even if we knew how to necessarily measure those positive regeneration or somehow, reversal of damages.
I like what you said, giving hope that the body does have, an ability to heal itself. We can just kind of direct it in the right way. Dr. Plopper, go ahead and chime in. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but I think the main question is, can, Alzheimer's and dementia, has there been any historical accounts of it being reversed, and what can we do to try and prevent it now?
I've not read that book, and from what I know, however, I wouldn't pay a lot of attention to it. I echo the sentiments that we really can't, as far as we know today, reverse the consequences of the Alzheimer's-like processes once they've fully developed. But what we do know, through large population studies and other types of studies is that each and every one of these lifestyle phenomena we talk about is relevant and does help prevent dementia. Through large studies of the Danish registry studies and others looking at populations and how and their histories relative to exercise, relative to food intake, relative to sleep, relative to other types of stressors, the dealing with those phenomena earlier in life, and especially hypertension, earlier in life will reap great benefits later in life in terms of the development of either vascular dementia or Alzheimer's or other types of dementias. So these lifestyle modifications are not just thoughts. I mean, these are proven interventions early in life which can alter the course of disease in humans. And so we really do need to pay attention to these things. Especially, as I mentioned, dealing with hypertension earlier in life relative to the onset of vascular dementia. It's sort of an understudied, underrepresented, it's not underrepresented, it's highly represented, I think, among the populations we're seeing. But it's a very preventable phenomenon in terms of how we address our lifestyle earlier in life. So I'll just stop with that.
Okay, so I think we've only asked half the panelists, but I'm going to continue. And I wish, right? We all wish that there was some research that showed that you could reverse the impacts, but and maybe one day something will be found. Dr. Glasgow, why don't you share your thoughts on what you know about reversing Alzheimer's and dementia, and what we can do to move forward and try and prevent it as soon as possible.
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to say one or two things about Dr. Bredesen's book, because I actually have seen it and browsed it. Dr. Bredesen in his book describes 9 patients with various kinds of symptoms, whom he developed some sort of personalized treatment plan for, and claims that all of them improved. All very well so far. There was no documentation on reading the book that any of these folks actually had Alzheimer's disease. It's possible 1 or 2 might have if one reads carefully, but there were people who were depressed. There was someone who had Parkinson's. There were a host of people without necessarily something that was absolutely and well defined. The interventions took place depending on a number of different factors that were personalized, and the duration of follow-up varied from one person to another. It could be 3 months, could be a year, or so forth. So it's really impossible to put this together as evidence that these interventions actually were helping in a sustainable way. Sounds like some of them probably did help people, at least temporarily, or that they actually made a difference to Alzheimer's disease. And that's the most critical point. There's a huge number of people and organizations out there trying to sell things. And there are all kinds of products that are being touted for brain health or for memory changes with aging. And if you read the fine print very carefully around many of these advertisements, they will say these have not been studied to prove that they have an impact on Alzheimer's disease. So be very careful, and as I say, read the fine print. If there were a host of products like this, then those of us on the call that see patients would be prescribing them as often as we could. We wouldn't be holding back. So having said that, there are studies, Dr. Proper mentioned some of them, looking at various aspects of lifestyle. Many of them have started in people in their 50s and 60s. However, there was a study looking at treatment of blood pressure in people aged 60 to 85. And this reduced all kinds of bad outcomes, heart attacks, strokes, and it also slowed or reduce the impact of blood pressure changes on the brain. So high blood pressure is one of the things that really can be treated in a very meaningful and impactful way in everybody. And this won't necessarily prevent Alzheimer's disease, but some people can have Alzheimer's disease pathology and shrug it off and never show any consequence. But some people will have a little bit of Alzheimer's and some hypertension-related changes or vascular pathology and begin to develop cognitive problems. So thinking holistically, I think there are things that we can try and do. They're not going to come with a guarantee that these are going to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but I think that they do have the potential to improve brain health. And we went through some of these earlier: the vascular risk, blood pressure, physical activity, sleep, cognitive activity. As far as diet goes, there's some evidence for a Mediterranean diet, but in general, avoiding diabetes and not being majorly overweight are probably more important than very specific kinds of diet. So I would kind of stop there with that very brief overview of brain health.
Dr. Glasgow, thank you. And I'm glad that you were able to give some insight to the participant who asked about that particular book, that you've actually had a chance to browse it. And I think you gave some context, perhaps that doctor did see patients improve, but whether or not they actually were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or, the background of that is unknown. So that was very helpful. Dr. Chen, let you have the floor.
Yeah, it's too good to be true. Well, that I would echo what Dr. Glasgow said. And one can look at sort of the footprint online of this particular researcher, who actually was in San Diego for some time, and it could be that there's some elements that overlap with what you've already heard from Dr. Plopper, but these types of lifestyle elements clearly have potential benefits. For example, keeping your weight, your BMI, your mass down, keeping active, keeping your blood pressure down. There's also evidence that people who are more highly educated have a lower incidence of Alzheimer's. So keeping mentally active might be one of the things. But these are, I would say, elements that you can pursue just as part of your own lifestyle. They're not things that are prescribed, for example. There was, for example, another question in the chat about whether if someone had epilepsy, they might be more prone to Alzheimer's. And the answer is it's not really that clear, but there are some studies that have linked external types of events. Could be head injury, could be CTE, as in the football players getting that. There are some links, but depends on what study you look at. Sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes no in terms of the statistical significance. And it all gets back to how carefully the study was actually pursued. And again, as Dr. Glasgow said, was it really Alzheimer's disease that was seen, or just dementia? And how do you classify this? So that's just a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of uncertainty in these types of things, and that a bit of common sense and sticking to working with your physician is the best first line, rather than taking something that may be potentially dangerous. And so that would be the direction I'd certainly head in with my own family. And I think it's some common sense there can be quite helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just monitoring the Q&A as we kind of have our last 20 minutes or so here on the forum. I've learned so much, and hopefully all of our participants have as well. Someone wrote, half joking, and I can relate to this because it is just half joking, but does being a caregiver increase your stress? It's a stress question. I know that I'm juggling a lot with my mom living with us, and it can get very stressful. And my job, I have 2 kids, and I feel sad that it's been since last June. June is Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. And so it's been Dr. Brewer since a year ago that I said I was going to reach out and try and see what I can do. And life just goes by so fast, and we come to forums like this, we read articles, we do, but it's sometimes hard to actually take action. So let's make that happen. But how do you reduce stress as a caregiver? Is that a risk factor? I'm going to assume yes. And Dr. Brewer, I'll let you speak to if you've read the book and just all of these things. Can it be
Yeah,
reversed?
no, I mean, what I typed in there, I mean, it's just, again, it's such, I noted, we know from clinical care and from our research studies that caregiving is probably one of the most stressful jobs out there. And I noted that caregivers are yet another category of heroes in this fight against Alzheimer's disease. It's a role that is so burdensome, and it's one of the things that I think we need more science about how to reduce that impact. I mean, so we know that in this disease, it's not just the patient that's greatly impacted by the illness; it's the entire family and certainly the caregiver. And in prior years at Date with a Cure, we bring Brent Mossbach. So I gave him a shout out in my answer because his science is outstanding and about caregiver and caregiver stress and possibly ways to mitigate it. And then I just ended with a little shout out to Alzheimer's San Diego support groups as one possible approach to reduce caregivers stress. So that was kind of my answer. It's a big topic, caregivers and caregiver stress. Stress is thought to be an impactful, is one of the pathways that people are interested in. I guess it's yet unknown whether the degree of stress in the days of caregiving are significant enough over a long enough time. That study is going to be really hard to conduct in a controlled manner, but I just referred people to Brent Mossbach's work and that of his colleagues to understand more about it.
Thank you all. I'm just kind of listening or reading. And again, thank you so much. Is there something physically going on in our bodies or brains that causes Alzheimer's? It is, I know Dr. Sefji mentioned a crossword puzzle earlier as far as the hope, and that these letters are being filled in, words are coming alive in the crossword puzzle of research treatment on our way to finding a cure of the disease. I kind of look at my mom's day-to-day journey caring for her with Alzheimer's as a jigsaw puzzle. And it's strange to me because, one day these pieces will be missing, but then the next day these pieces will be in place, and then these pieces will be missing. Just what she retains, what she remembers differs from day to day. And I think it's hard for those of us who don't have Alzheimer's to, it's like, well, but yesterday she knew this, today she doesn't know it, but tomorrow she might know that and not know something else that she did know. I mean, it's very confusing, I think, sometimes as a caregiver, as a loved one. Whoever would like to jump in and just try and help those of us who are on here who have someone that we love, that we're trying to learn more about, which is, I think, a lot of the people on here. Can you give us some advice on just how to navigate that? Because it can be stressful and frustrating for us as well.
I would like to speak a little bit about that. I think the best way to envision it is if you think about even those of us that, as far as we know, don't have any cognitive problems. If you don't get enough sleep, if you're really tired, if you haven't eaten and you're hungry, your brain doesn't work as well as when you're at the top of your game. And so generally the variability or the fluctuation in someone with Alzheimer's ability to remember things or to function has to do with other factors. I mean, if there's, again, more stress or not enough sleep, that, chances are they're going to have a worse day. There's probably factors that we don't understand at play that also make a difference. In terms of coping with that, I think those of you that act as caregivers for loved ones with Alzheimer's or any type of dementia, you're really heroes. There is no easy answer because it just is very difficult. I think one thing someone dear to me who became a caregiver said, though, that when her husband was finally diagnosed, she was much happier because she realized that he couldn't help what he was doing. It wasn't that he was ignoring her. It wasn't that he was not listening to her. It just, his brain would not retain the information. And so that sort of acceptance, I think, goes a little way towards making it a little easier to cope with. But that's certainly not to underestimate just how hard it is on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Dr. Sefji. Would anyone else like to chime in with some final thoughts? We have about 10 minutes left here. More questions coming in about diet. I have heard personally, I have a friend whose mom has Lewy body and she's about my age, middle-aged. You say I'm too young, but I'm starting to get older. And she has tried to eliminate all carbohydrates from her diet. She said she read somewhere that, well, with her mom in particular, like the minute you gave her mom something that had a lot of carbohydrates, you could see the change like almost instantly. So she's trying to eliminate that from her diet. I know we had a question from someone asking about keto. Dr. Brewer, you answered, but if anyone wants to weigh in about, life changes, diet changes, restrictions, that there have been studies that have, possibly proven or indicated that some diets are better than the other.
So it's a pretty good segue from that prior topic, because when you just mentioned dementia with Lewy bodies and we were talking about fluctuation in function, dementia with Lewy bodies is characterized by odd fluctuations in function, some good days, some bad days, and being able to then tie that together with an intervention becomes very challenging. Although, I encourage, trying to figure out what it is that leads to a person's good days and bad days, but it may be just part of the disease. One of the interesting parts of that prior question about fluctuation, it brings forth the state of the environment. So there's a lot of interest in reminiscence therapy and putting people in an environment that's very calming and familiar. And we know that when a person with cognitive impairment makes their way in a very unfamiliar environment, stressful environment, like the hospital, you're going to see a tremendous drop in function, almost to the point where you say, what the heck just happened? Something acutely must have just happened. No, it's just the environment has changed to an unfamiliar, stressful state, and that just makes them fall off a cliff. So I think it's very interesting. I think the idea of what are the factors that make a person function better or worse, and are there some medications that might be able to calm that down? It's always an area that I think is understudied. We at the UCSD Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study took on an extraordinarily challenging research, multi-site research topic of agitation and Alzheimer's disease, called the PEACE-AD study, where it had to be done in individuals who are already agitated. So we went out to skilled nursing facilities, and just the logistics of that study is so challenging. You understand why we don't know enough about this field, because it's just hard to conduct such a study to understand how can I reduce these fluctuations in agitation and other stresses that happen later in the disease. So I think, I don't know if there's a direct answer to that, but it just means a lot of more, like many of these answers, a lot more research is needed. So if you just went down, we try to plug away on these last few questions. What do you think of simufilam? Well, very controversial. You'll read the New Yorker article. We could talk about that, but there was some mixed motivations in the science there, and you're just gonna. But still, more research is needed. What's the risk of Alzheimer's after grand mal epileptic seizures? More research needed. Caregiver and stress, more research needed. So we can almost.
I think I think we don't need research on that. No, as far as caregivers experiencing stress, but yeah, ways to lower our own stress too. It's hard because I think I can do everything, and I reached out to Alzheimer's San Diego because I had my coworker Carlo Cicchetto. His father had Alzheimer's disease, and he has been very involved in Alzheimer's San Diego. And when my mom was diagnosed, he pointed me there, and I kept putting him off. Like I said, I was kind of in denial. And then my boss assigned it to me as a news story. So then I thought, well, I have to go do it as part of my job. and it just opened up this whole world of resource and like being able to collaborate now with to learn from all of you. It's been such a gift. So I think the first step is reaching out if you're just kind of in the beginning stages. And then if you're farther along, knowing that you have this community of support is so important, because we do think I want to do it all, but we can't do it all. We need to lean on other people for support. So thank you all. I know time is, your time is very valuable, and I appreciate you coming here to help give support to others. Also, for those who are here, if you know of other people that would benefit from this, we're going to be sharing this entire webinar on a link that Alzheimer's at San Diego will send out. And also all of the questions that our panelists have been so kind to answer. Every question through the last 2 hours is just amazing. I was worried we were going to not be able to get to all of them, but I'm pretty sure that we got to all of them. Is there anything else anyone would like to add before we wrap up here?
I'd just like to say that how remarkable it is that in this community we have a large number of people who are willing to volunteer for clinical trials. You are making a contribution by doing that, not only potentially for yourself, but also for your loved ones and others. But the degree of interest in clinical trials in this community is amazing and very gratifying. And so thanks to all of you, and spread the word. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Wait, I just saw something pop up.
I
Let me
guess
just make
along
sure.
those same lines, it's such a privilege to be in this scientific environment here. Not only I've been in other environments, Stanford, Hopkins, some of these, New York City, some of these really esteemed areas, but nothing compares to UC San Diego. I think it's, the San Diego area, because it's more than just UC San Diego, because the collaboration across the different health systems, and certainly the MESA. We have the Sanford Burnham Prebys Medical Discovery Institute. We have the Scripps Research Institute. We have the J. Craig Venter, Genomics Institute. We have this main campus here. We have the biotech industry and the genetics biotech. It's unlike anywhere else in the country. And we've had faculty, get recruited away to say, oh my gosh, I got a huge startup someplace else, or I got a huge startup package. And within a year, they're asking to come back because they say this is not the intellectual neuroscientist playground that San Diego is. And they want to come back, not just for the weather. I think part of it may be the weather, but I think a lot of it is the scientific environment that is so collaborative and unsiloed. People collaborate together. They like to work together. They have their values in the right place. They want, they want to be in a place that has good living, but they want to make a great impact on the science. And so I just think it can't be overstated how special this place is, San Diego. So, and thanks Alzheimer's San Diego for supporting the science of the local work that's going on here.
Yeah, I also wanted to chime in and just make sure we acknowledge Alzheimer's San Diego, because from, providing funds for research to, just all the work that they do, and everyone I've ever met from there is just an amazing person. So, we are very lucky to have them as an organization here in our community. And thank you for continuing to do this event every year.
Yes, thank you so much, Alzheimer's San Diego, because I was forced to reach out to you as part of my job. My mom got an Alzheimer's companion, Claudia, and she's on the board of Alzheimer's San Diego as well. And she's become a family friend, and just so much support. And it's so comforting to know that people understand what you're going through. Just that alone helps decrease the stress, knowing that you can have, lead on other people. And I've been able to get my mom respite care when we go away on our vacations. I was trying to bring her, but it was, like you said, Dr. Brewer, the change in environment, the unfamiliar environment of hotels and so forth. She'd get agitated and confused. And normally, like I said, she's a pretty happy person. So we decided it would be better for her to have a routine somewhere safe that she could stay. So as an only child, I'm grateful to have here in San Diego a place that I can put her for 3 weeks and know that she's going to be safe. So thank you so much to everyone. I'm so sorry to have to wrap this up, but that is time. It's 10:57. Want to be honoring your time. And again, thank you to each one of our panelists, Dr. Doris Molina Henry, Dr. Sherry Sefji, Dr. Michael Plopper, Dr. Gerald Chun, Dr. Douglas Velasco, Dr. James Brewer. I mean, just what a meeting of the minds. It's incredible. We received some incredible information and insight this morning. And best of all, we learned that there is very real progress being made to find a cure for Alzheimer's. And I love all of the hope that we're looking at. With more research needing to be done, we need more people to step up to do these clinical trials. And so, yes, San Diegans, thank you for stepping up. And as we've been talking about all morning, we cannot find a cure without you, because the first person to be cured of dementia or Alzheimer's is going to be someone in a clinical trial. And we are going to be rejoicing that day. I can't wait to share it on the news that day. Again, if you'd like to learn more about local research and how you can help, contact Alzheimer's San Diego. They can point you in the right direction. In fact, if you've been monitoring that chat box, you'll see a link they just shared where you can request a follow-up with a clinical care coach for more information. They do one-on-one advice, which is amazing. And there's also a form if you'd like more information about research or any of the free services like education, virtual support groups, All's companion visits, which again is what my mom, we've just been so nourished by that in our life. And if you can't jot down everything in the chat group, they'll put all the resources on their website, allssd.org. Once again, thank you so much to our amazing panel for sharing your morning with us. And thanks to everyone for coming. I hope you have left with more knowledge and more hope about the search for a cure. Bye, everyone.